Hi, Greg, and thank you so much for taking again the time to be here with us. And today we're going to talk about intermittent fasting, part two. And the reason of that is that we noticed that our first one, when we talked about flexibility, metabolism flexibility, and intermittent fasting, it had actually a really good turnout. So that's why we're going to continue. And today we're going to concentrate into a podcast that you shared with me, and thank you so much for that, of Dr. Chris, and how we do also intermittent fasting. How do you do, and how do I do, from our personal points of view, and also different ways how we can do that, right? Because we always talk about intermittent fasting, but what is that? How we do that? So, as mentioned before, you shared with me a very interesting podcast of Dr. Chris, and I have to be honest, I was really fascinated about the findings and how he was talking about intermittent fasting and relations with vitamin D and exercise, and especially the brisk walk versus a slow walk, which we'll deepen more into. But I know the podcast was quite extensive and a very interesting one, but we don't want to overwhelm our listeners. So let's just, how about we focus on what parts of from this podcast you find interesting related to intermittent fasting?
Yeah, so we'll put a link to the Dr. Chris Kresser, put a link to that podcast, and he links to the various studies. But though he often does interviews with people, this one he just does a review of recent research. And so he goes through a number of research areas, and so I'll have information from the studies on those that I'll just place in the video here too. But one of the things we talk about intermittent fasting, and that's another word for time-restricted eating, and that's often used in diets where they say, well, just eat between these hours. Well, those are complicated diet things, but one of the points of time-restricted eating, intermittent fasting, is to have metabolic flexibility. And the idea is when you're eating a healthy diet, you're not hungry all the time. You don't have to eat. Let's say if you're traveling, you maybe go a whole day without having more than a cup of coffee. Having the flexibility to do that is, a benefit, and it turns out it also is good for the body. And that was one of the studies he talks about when people are in ketosis, that is, they're burning body fat instead of glucose, it has these various metabolic benefits. And so he talks about the comparing low carb and keto diets in some of the studies there. And so anyway, that was some of the studies he talked about. Again, we'll put those on the link, but one was particularly on colorectal cancer. So there's a lot of discussion of how being in ketosis or not eating carbohydrates can benefit people who have cancer. Certain types of cancers feed on glucose. They ferment glucose. So if you don't have glucose in your body, the cancers that feed on that don't. So colorectal cancer, they did a study of people that were in ketosis, that is, not eating carbohydrates, burning body fat, which means you have a ketones. And one of the ketones, in particularly hydroxybutyrate, suppresses colorectal cancer. And they gave the data on that, and it was a huge benefit for people who had this ketone in their body, had much lower rates of colorectal cancer, which is like the second or third biggest killer. So that was one of the studies that he talked about.
And sorry, Greg, I'm going to intervene here because I also listen to the podcast. And what I found fascinating is that when he talks about these type of cancers, he also mentioned that people should know exactly how to do, or if intermittent fasting is beneficial for them, because intermittent fasting, apparently it's very beneficial for this type of cancer that you just mentioned, but not for all of them, or at least it wasn't proved, correct?
Yes, he emphasized that, and he was very emphatic that you want to look into this and don't think that it's a cure. Stop eating sugar, don't feed the cancer is sort of a meme that's popular. And again, cancers are very diverse, very adaptable. There's a whole bunch of different kinds.
And I will add to that as well, because when I was listening, I was also fascinated. He was talking about other And I think we touch a little bit on that on our first postcard, that the intermittent fasting, it's not beneficial for every people. For example, people who are suffering from thyroid, and he's explaining why. And that's true, right? Because you can mess up with your hormones, and especially when you have thyroid, you're very prone and you're very sensitive to hormones and fluctuation, and everybody will experience that, but especially women, and especially person who suffer from thyroid. And he always stressed the idea in his podcast that you have to be very careful when you choose the intermittent fasting, first to check your health, to check with your doctor, and make sure that you actually you can do the intermittent fasting, right? Because it's not just cancer. There are other diseases that maybe they're not very beneficial with the intermittent fasting.
Yeah, and again, there's a complexity with the words. It used to be, at least in the US, people would have dinner, at 6 and not eat again until breakfast at 7 or 8 in the morning. Well, is that time restricted eating? Is that intermittent fasting? Well, if you break your fast with breakfast. So you could call that fasting, where you don't snack into the evening and don't get up in the middle of the night and eat. So I think there's a natural way to restrict our eating, which is not snacking all the time. But some people have metabolisms that, they feel like they need to eat all the time. And so I don't know how the body adapts. Different people adapt differently. You've got hormonal issues, and how long does it take? And of course, it depends what you eat. People who eat an egg or eat, protein and healthy fat, often it's a long time before they feel like they need to eat, because the carbohydrates, critics say, particularly processed carbs or hyper palatable foods that mix, fat and protein together, or fat and carbs together, people, really, they can't resist. They want to eat more and more and more. So people are different, the foods are different, and our behaviors are different. Some people are in the habit, they go to a movie and they order popcorn, buttered popcorn with who knows what on it. I was always so cheap that I hated the price of it. I would never buy candy or popcorn. And because I followed the rules, I wouldn't sneak things in like my friends did. So I've gotten the habit of never eating at a movie. So
yes,
I'm like, no fun.
Here.
I'm no fun to go to a movie with for someone who wants food. But it's a habit. It's not craving. It's not this or that. It's just a habit. And so I think a lot of our people who eat the wrong things or too often or what, it's a cultural habit that they've developed over time. And, it's a challenge sometimes to break those habits. But you're right. Particular people with hormonal issues, thyroid, those are going to be different person to person. I don't know how you shape and change those with foods, or if you can, or medications.
Mm-hmm. And since we brought this up, how would you do intermittent fasting? What's your experience on that?
So each time the word intermittent fasting is used, I sort of step back and say, I didn't try to do anything. I ate when I was hungry, but I found when I first started losing weight in April 2020, that I just wasn't hungry. When I stopped eating breakfast cereal, my Raisin Bran and all that stuff, it turned out I wasn't that hungry in the morning. And though people are told, breakfast is the most important meal, well, maybe it is for some people, but it turned out not to be for me. And again, at my age, maybe when I was 20 or 40 years younger, maybe I needed to eat more. I have no idea. But it's partly thinking about, am I hungry or am I just bored? And so I just stepped back and I ate more butter, saturated fat, whole milk, meat, eggs. Those things seemed to satiate, me. I wasn't hungry. And so I went longer without eating. And I found when I was busy or traveling, I didn't need to eat at all. A cup of coffee and I seemed fine. So this panic of, I better find something to eat. I haven't eaten all day. I don't know if I just pushed that out of my mind or if somehow my body changed, but this is what they call keto adapted. The natural thing through human history and prehistory is to eat when there's food, but they say the hunters and gatherers would go a day or 2 days or 3 days when they didn't have food, and they naturally would draw on their body fats to do that. So for most people, you can become keto adapted, where you're comfortable drawing on your body fat. and not eating. You just have electrolytes or water. And you can test your blood to see if you're burning ketones. And that means you're drawing on your body fat, which has all these other metabolic benefits that are discussed in research and podcasts.
Yeah, as you mentioned, for me, intermittent fasting is basically having 2 meals a day. And in general, I do eat my breakfast just to have some energy. Like, for example, today it's a gorgeous day out, so I'm planning to bike quite a bit. So I had my coffee, and after that I'll have my breakfast. But again, my dinner was really early, around 5:30, right? So I think that window, but I don't feel hungry. It's just that I need some energy, because it's true that after biking for a while, then I feel a bit dizzy. But that's how I do a dinner around 5-6, and then my breakfast around 9 or 10, and that's kind of about it, right? So I guess we can call it as well intermittent fasting.
I'd mention on that too, that one of the things they emphasize is if you don't need to lose weight, if you're metabolically healthy, if you were heavier and were thinking, gosh, I wish I could lose some weight, it may be that you could develop shifting into ketosis. And, people have bicycled, all day, 2 days without eating anything, because they're keto adapted and their body's burning the body fat. So if you're too busy to have breakfast, again, it takes a while to adapt, but people adapt into burning ketones, burning body fat for energy. And so metabolic flexibility means you can have food, or not. And of course, your food can be protein, fat, or carbohydrate.
And just to finish and wrap up our podcast here, I know we mentioned, and you just mentioned right now, that the broad, like intermittent fasting, it's a broad term, but I know there are out there some ways of doing like 14 or 16 and 8 windows hour or stuff like that. Can you just summarize for our listener a few of those things? Or sometimes they say just fast 2 days and just eat 500 calories a day, and then you can eat whatever, and that's intermittent fasting as well. Or 14 with 12 hours. I can't remember actually, but
going a couple days is fasting. I would say fasting is when you go some days. Intermittent fasting, that at least as I'm familiar with the term, is the same as time restricted eating. You're saying, I'm only going to eat within this window of 6 hours or 8 hours or 12 hours, and the rest of the time I'm not going to eat, or not going to eat carbohydrates. And the advantage of that, again, we're talking in the previous podcast, we've talked about insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome. A lot of people, when they eat carbohydrates, it causes their blood glucose to spike, causes insulin to spike, leading to high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, other sorts of issues. The advantage of not eating for 12 hours or 16 hours or whatever is your body rests, your digestive system can rest. And when you shift into burning ketones instead of glucose, it has other metabolic benefits. So that's what I understand that to mean. And again, people's bodies are different, and there's other health issues. That's why for people that are diabetic or obese, having a continuous glucose monitor, you can hear on your app, learn on your app what's actually happening in your body. So that's what the Virta Health does. And so your goal is to have a smooth blood glucose level, no spikes, and you don't want to go too low. That's when you feel exhausted, run out of energy. So that's just the story, is getting a healthy blood glucose level. And metabolic flexibility means you can get the energy from glucose, from carbs, or from protein that you can actually burn, but you don't want to burn too much protein. That's burning your body, your muscles. Ideally, you'd burn body fat or carbohydrates.
Right. No, that's great and fascinating. And I'm sure people out there will be interested to listen and how you do it, how I do it, and how they can do it, right? And know more about it. And I think it's such a complex complex theme, but I know for our listener, you're going to add the link to the podcast of our doctor that we mentioned. We encourage you to listen. It's really nice. It's 50 minutes long, but you will learn a lot, and it's really well explained. Yeah. And thank you so much, Greg. And I think I'll see you next time, maybe with part 3.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.